In 2133, the newly formed Interplanetary Strategic Alliance turned its gaze towards a distant world known as Gyre. At first glance, the planet seemed unlikely to welcome human life. It was smaller than Vecta and far colder, its surface dominated by dark, restless oceans that stretched endlessly beneath pale skies. From orbit, Gyre looked entirely blue. Vast oceans covered most of its surface, broken only by countless islands scattered like fragments across the water. Some were little more than rocky outcrops, others stretched into lush chains of land, shaped by wind, salt, and time. Millions of them dotted the oceans, creating a world that felt less like a continent, and more like an endless archipelago. Against all expectations, the planet's air was already rich with oxygen, clean and naturally breathable. The long, costly process of terraforming that most colonies required suddenly became unnecessary, which should have taken decades, could begin immediately. For the ISA, Gyre represented an opportunity, a ready-made frontier where humanity could expand without reshaping the planet itself. For decades, the planet's vast industrial networks had relied heavily on Helghast laborers, many of whom worked in the shipyards, refineries, and manufacturing complexes scattered across Gyre's endless island chains. These facilities powered the ISA's off-world economy, but the workers who kept them running endured punishing hours, unsafe machinery, and living conditions that grew steadily worse with each passing year. At first, the unrest took form of organized protest. Millions of Helghast laborers, many alleged with powerful industrial unions, gathered outside the factory gates and government buildings, demanding safer conditions and accountability from the corporations that control Gyre's industrial sector. Their accusations were severe. Workers claimed that the factory owners had ignored repeated safety violations and knowingly exposed employees to dangerous equipment and hazardous environments. When several catastrophic accidents pushed the issue into the courts, many believed justice would follow. Instead, the accused factory owners were acquitted. The verdict spread through Gyre like a spark in dry fuel. What had begun as protests quickly hardened into anger. Demonstrations grew larger and more confrontational. Crowds flooded industrial districts, blocking production lines and seizing control of union offices. Soon the unrest spilled beyond the factories themselves. Government buildings were occupied. Entire districts fell under the control of Helghast labor groups. The crisis had become a revolt. Gyre's military attempted to restore order, but the scale of the uprising was far beyond what the planet's security forces could contain. With millions involved and key urban centers slipping out of government control, the authorities faced a grim reality. A violent crackdown could ignite a full civil war. Reluctantly, the government chose another path. Negotiations began with the Helghast Workers' Union Party, the political movement that had emerged from the labor organizations at the center of the uprising. Only through fragile talks and the promise of reforms did the violence begin to subside, bringing an uneasy end to one of the most volatile crises in Gyre's history. The upheaval of Gyre did not end when the protests faded from the streets. The political consequences arrived soon after. Public outrage over the government's handling of the crisis continued to grow, and the pressure eventually broke the ruling administration. In the months that followed the revolt, the Eldritch government faced a storm of criticism. Opposition parties accused it of failing to protect the workers, allowing the planet to spiral into chaos. The accusations culminated in a decisive vote of no confidence, forcing the Eldritch leadership to step down. New elections were called. Across Gyre's island cities and industrial hubs, voters turned toward the very movement that had risen from the unrest itself. The Workers' Union Party, campaigning on a promise of reform, worker protections, and the end to corporate negligence. The party quickly gained widespread support. When the votes were counted, the Workers' Union Party had taken control of the government. For a time, many believed Gyre had entered a new chapter, but the promises of reform soon began to unravel. Rather than delivering the sweeping changes they had pledged, the new leadership consolidated its authority. Emergency powers introduced during the crisis were quietly extended. Political opposition was restricted, demonstrations were suppressed, and the criticism of the government increasingly drew the attention of the security forces. What had been presented as a workers' victory began to resemble something far more restrictive. The disillusionment spread quickly, among the Helghast workers who had helped bring the party to power, and among the Vectan citizens who watched the political upheaval with growing concern. In a rare moment of unity between the two groups, demonstrators from both communities returned to the streets. Together, Helghast and Vectans condemned the government that had risen from their shared struggle, accusing it of betraying the very movement that had placed it in power.